At first, it feels like nothing happened. No explosion, no dramatic confession, no final scene where they fall to their knees and tell you everything you needed to hear. Just silence. A strange, hollow silence. The kind that makes you question whether the whole relationship lived anywhere outside your body at all. You leave, and the room stays still. Your phone doesn't light up the way you imagined. There is no immediate collapse, no visible panic, no proof. And that is the part that cuts the deepest. Because when you finally walk away from someone avoidant, the first thing you often meet is not their pain. It is your own. Your own shaking hands. Your own withdrawal. Your own late-night urge to go back and explain yourself one more time. Your own mind whispering, maybe I was too much. Maybe I gave up too soon. Maybe if I had just stayed calmer, softer, easier to love, they would have chosen me. But here is the brutal truth most people never want to face. As long as you stayed, they did not have to feel you. They could manage you in fragments, respond when the pressure faded, reach for you when the distance felt safe, pull away when intimacy started asking something real from them. And because you loved deeply, because you kept translating their coldness into hidden pain, because you kept calling their confusion complexity and their absence a wound you could heal, the pattern survived. Not because it was love, because it was tolerated. That is the truth that breaks people open. Not that they were unloving, not even that they meant to hurt you, but that your endless understanding became the shelter where their avoidance never had to confront itself. You kept the bridge standing while they learned to visit halfway. You kept making meaning out of mixed signals. You kept bleeding in private so the connection could breathe in public. And when you finally stop, when you finally leave for real, something changes inside them that does not happen while you are still available. Because now your love is no longer regulating their fear. Now they have to meet the echo. People misunderstand avoidant attachment because they only watch the surface. They see someone go cold, detach, disappear into work, routine, distraction, logic. They think they never cared. They think, if this mattered, they'd be devastated. But avoidant people often do not process loss in the same moment other people do. They delay it. They suppress first, feel later. Their nervous system learned a long time ago that needing someone is dangerous. Depending is dangerous. Being fully seen is dangerous. Somewhere deep in the body, closeness got paired with pressure, expectation, engulfment, shame, disappointment. So when love gets too near, when emotion gets too honest, the amygdala can react as if intimacy itself is a threat. The body shifts into protection. Cortisol rises, muscles tighten, thoughts flatten. Distance starts feeling safer than connection, even if connection is what they secretly wanted. That is why they can miss you and still not call, care and still withdraw, love and still go numb. Not because the bond meant nothing, because the bond touched places they do not know how to survive while staying open. And here is the part nobody tells you. When you were there, they could regulate that panic by creating distance from you. A delayed text, a canceled plan, a vague answer, a little wall, a little shutdown, a little emotional disappearance. That space gave their body relief. It lowered the intensity. It restored control. But when you leave, truly leave, that strategy stops working. Because now the distance is no longer theirs, it's yours. And that changes everything. Now they cannot calm themselves with the fantasy that you are still there, waiting in emotional reach, quietly holding the door open while they sort themselves out. Now the attachment system begins to shift in a way they hate to admit. The one thing they counted on without naming it, your continued presence, has vanished. And suddenly, the silence feels different to them than it ever did to you. Not peaceful, not freeing, unclaimed. That is when the mind starts doing strange things. They remember your voice at random hours. They hear your laugh inside ordinary moments. They look at their phone with no intention of texting, then realize they have checked it 6 times in 10 minutes. They pass places you once sat in and feel something tighten behind the ribs before they can explain it. They start replaying conversations they barely seemed present for when they were happening. Because now there is no immediate threat of engulfment, only absence. And absence is where avoidant people often begin to feel. This is why sometimes they come back after weeks, or months, or just when you have finally started to breathe again. Not because they suddenly transformed overnight, not because they woke up one morning with miraculous emotional clarity, but because your departure forced them into contact with what their defenses were keeping out. Loss, need, longing, regret. The very feelings they outran while you were still there. And the most unsettling part is that it often happens in reverse. While you are with them, you are the one obsessing. You are the one decoding. You're the one staring at the gap between what they feel and what they can show. You are the one losing sleep, trying to stabilize something unstable. Then you leave. And slowly, invisibly, the current starts to turn. Your silence becomes the unanswered question. Your absence becomes the unfinished sentence. Your withdrawal becomes the mirror they cannot control. That is the core concept most people miss. Silence. Not performative silence, not punishment, not a strategy designed to manipulate them into chasing. Real silence. The kind born from self-respect. The kind that says, I will no longer stand in the doorway of your fear and call it home. That silence does something words never could. Because when you kept explaining your pain, they could intellectualize it. When you kept asking for reassurance, they could feel pressured and retreat. When you kept trying to get closure, they could stay in the role they know best, guarded, uncertain, emotionally cornered. But when you become still, when you step back and stop feeding the cycle with your availability, your silence bypasses the old dance. Now they have to experience you instead of manage you. Now there is space wide enough for your absence to become real. Imagine them late at night, in a room that looks exactly the same as it did before, but somehow feels wrong. They open an app, close it, start a message, erase it. Tell themselves they are fine. Tell themselves this is for the best. Tell themselves relationships are complicated, timing was off, emotions were messy, maybe this was inevitable. But underneath that clean language, something more primal begins to stir. Why does everything feel flat? Why am I thinking about them now? Why did their presence feel suffocating then, and their absence feel unbearable now? Why do I suddenly want what I was pulling away from? Because distance has changed shape. Before, distance was a defense. Now, distance is deprivation. And the body knows the difference. There is a cruel irony in avoidant dynamics. When closeness is offered too freely, it can activate fear. But when that closeness is removed, the same person may begin to feel an ache that borders on obsession. Dopamine often works this way. Intermittent reward, emotional inconsistency, unpredictability, these conditions can intensify fixation. What they could not fully receive in safety, they may start craving in loss. Not always because they are ready, sometimes just because they are activated. That distinction matters, because this is where many people break. They feel the shift, the text, the sudden warmth, the check-in that arrives after silence, the message that says, "I've been thinking about you," the subtle vulnerability, the tiny crack in the armor they spent months begging to see. And because your heart is tender, because part of you has prayed for this exact moment, you almost mistake movement for change. But a reaching hand is not the same as healed hands. Missing you is not the same as being ready for intimacy. Pain does not automatically create maturity. Sometimes they come back because losing you hurts. Sometimes they come back because your absence dysregulated them. Sometimes they come back because the silence exposed their feelings. And sometimes they come back only long enough to soothe the panic of losing access, not to build something different. You have to understand this in your bones. An avoidant can miss you deeply and still repeat the pattern. They can cry and still retreat. They can confess and still disappear. They can mean every word in the moment and still not have the nervous system capacity to stay open when closeness returns. This is why your power was never supposed to come from whether they chase. It comes from whether you can see clearly when they do. Because the real transformation is not just what changes inside them when you leave. It is what changes inside you when you stop making their inner conflict your responsibility. That is the moment the whole story begins to break. When you no longer measure your worth by how emotionally available they become. When you stop treating their hesitation like a puzzle that proves your value if you solve it. When you stop translating scraps of affection into promises. When you stop abandoning your own nervous system to keep theirs comfortable. Something fierce returns to you then. Not rage, not bitterness. Authority. A quiet kind of power. The kind that no longer needs to be chosen by someone emotionally split in order to feel real. The kind that does not tremble every time a text arrives. The kind that can hear, "I miss you," and still ask, "Can you meet me consistently, honestly, fully?" The kind that does not confuse longing with safety. And that is exactly why everything changes inside them. Because for the first time, they are no longer relating to a version of you that overfunctions, overexplains, overextends, overweights. They are relating to someone they can lose, really lose. Someone whose love is no longer dangling at the edge of their indecision like an emergency exit. That is terrifying to a person who only learned the value of intimacy once it became unavailable. And yes, sometimes that terror turns into pursuit. They reach out more. They think about you more. They feel your imprint more vividly. They start comparing everyone to the emotional depth they once had access to, but could not receive. They wonder if they ruined something rare. They feel haunted by the steadiness they took for granted. They begin, in quiet moments, to understand that what overwhelmed them was not your neediness, but the intimacy of being truly loved. That realization can shake them.
but do not romanticize the shake. Pain can open the door. It does not guarantee they will walk through it, and if they do not do the deeper work, if they do not face the original wound, the fear of dependency, the shutdown reflex, the shame around need, the body-level panic that closeness triggers, then eventually the cycle returns. Maybe softer, maybe slower, maybe in prettier language, but it returns. This is the warning. Do not go back just because they finally feel what you felt all along. Do not return to the fire just because they have now touched the smoke. If you break your pattern too early, if you rush back the moment they soften, if you let one emotional confession erase months of instability, you teach the old dynamic that it still works, that all they have to do is feel enough pain to pull you back, not change enough to keep you safe. And you deserve more than being rediscovered every time you leave. You deserve to be held while you are still there. So, if they come back, let your nervous system answer before your wound does. Let your body tell the truth your loneliness wants to distort. Do you feel calm or just relieved? Do you feel chosen or just reactivated? Do you feel met or simply wanted because you became unavailable? These questions matter because the version of you who once begged for crumbs will call any returning hand a miracle. But the version of you becoming whole will look deeper. She will look at consistency. He will look at emotional capacity. They will look at whether the connection can survive closeness, not just separation. That is the real standard, not whether they miss you, whether they can meet you. Because being missed is not the highest form of love. Being safe is. And here is the final shift, the one that changes your life more than any apology ever could. When you finally leave an avoidant, yes, everything changes inside them. But that is not the miracle. The miracle is when their internal change stops being the center of your story. When you no longer wake up wondering what they are realizing. When you no longer need to know whether they regret it.
When you no longer build your healing around the fantasy that one day they will fully understand what they lost. Because one day, if you keep going, you become something they can no longer disturb so easily. You become unavailable to confusion, unavailable to half-love, unavailable to emotional malnutrition dressed up as chemistry. You stop calling instability passion. You stop calling longing proof. You stop calling your own self-abandonment devotion. And in that new identity, something almost sacred happens. You become harder to manipulate. Because you are no longer starving. Harder to confuse because you trust your body. Harder to lose because you are no longer leaving yourself to stay with someone else. That is power. Not the power of making them chase. The power of no longer needing to be chased to know your worth. So if you are in that raw place now, if you have just walked away, and the silence is making you doubt everything, listen closely. Their numbness is not always peace. Their distance is not always indifference. Their delay is not always the absence of love. Sometimes your leaving is the first moment they actually feel the full weight of what this was. But whether they feel it or not cannot be the thing that decides your future. Let them wrestle with their own interior. Let them meet the emptiness their defenses created. Let them learn, if they choose to learn,
that love cannot survive where safety is always postponed. And you keep walking. You keep becoming. You keep choosing the version of yourself that no longer confuses being deeply affected with being deeply valued. Because the truth is, the person who keeps you in anxiety is not your home, no matter how intensely your heart beats for them. The person who can only love you once you are gone is not ready for the kind of love you are trying to give. And the chapter that breaks you open is not always the chapter meant to keep you. Sometimes it came to show you where you were still bargaining your worth away. Sometimes it came to expose the part of you that thought love had to be earned through patience, pain, and emotional endurance. Sometimes it came to teach you the holiest lesson of all. You do not have to stay where you are slowly disappearing. So leave if you need to leave. Leave without translating your worth into whether they react. Leave without waiting for proof. Leave without needing them to collapse for your pain to count. Because the deepest revenge is not their regret. It is your return to yourself. And when that return is complete, when your self-worth is no longer on loan to someone emotionally unavailable, when your peace matters more than their mixed signals, when your standards become stronger than your cravings, you will understand something that once felt impossible to believe. You were never hard to love. You were just standing in front of someone who was terrified of what real love would require from them. That was never your failure, and it is no longer your burden. Now let them sit in the silence. You were carrying both hearts for too long. Now carry your own. And watch what happens when, for the first time, you choose not to look back.